Welcome back to Nutrition 101. This course follows Sizer and Whitney's Nutrition, Concepts and Controversies, 16th edition, but I've made adjustments by skipping and rearranging some of the material and adding my own images and information. This video covers Chapter 6, the Proteins and Amino Acids, which will be the final stop on our journey into the 3 macronutrients. When discussing macronutrients, you almost always see it as protein in the singular form. However, protein takes numerous forms in the body, and so for the purposes of this lesson, we'll start with proteins in the plural. The learning objectives for this lesson are to describe the structure of proteins and amino acids, explore the basics of protein metabolism, emphasizing digestion, absorption, storage, and turnover, examine the roles of body proteins, and discuss nutrition recommendations for protein. Proteins are compounds composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Nitrogen is necessary for the various roles proteins play in the body and distinguishes them from carbohydrates and fat, which generally do not contain it. Proteins are arranged as strands of amino acids, so they're often referred to as the building blocks. This arrangement is similar to what we saw in Chapter 4, where I highlighted polysaccharides as long strands of glucose molecules. Nevertheless, there are way more amino acids than sugars. In fact, there are 20 amino acids that make up proteins in the human body. All have a backbone with a carbon atom, an amine group, and an acid group, and each one has a unique side chain that changes its size, shape, and electrical charge. Out of the 20 amino acids, 9 of them are essential amino acids. That means they must be obtained through the diet in sufficient amounts, otherwise a deficiency will develop. The other 11 amino acids are non-essential amino acids, meaning the body can create them using fragments of different amino acids and compounds. Here's the basic structure of the amino acids. On the left side, you see the nitrogen-containing amine group. On the right side, you see the acid group. Then in the middle, the carbon atom is connected to the side chain. That side chain is different for each of the 20 amino acids. For example, we can look at the side chain for the amino acid serine. Again, these side chains not only give the amino acid its identity, it also changes its size, shape, and electrical charge, which can change the shape of a protein once various amino acids are combined. With 20 different side chains, we get 20 different amino acids. A star indicates that the amino acid is essential, meaning one must obtain a sufficient amount of it in their diet to maintain homeostasis. At this stage, we've established that the amino acids are connected to create proteins. Now, we'll look a bit closer at this process. Put another way, we're asking ourselves, how do amino acids build proteins? Strands of amino acids are created with peptide bonds. The amine group of one amino acid is connected to the acid group of another, and then more and more amino acids are added until the protein is formed. Proteins can contain dozens, hundreds, or thousands of amino acids, and as the amino acids are added, the strand can coil and fold so that many complete proteins take on a globular or spherical shape. Once the strand is completed, some proteins are functional as is, others must join with other proteins, carbohydrates, vitamins, or minerals. Thanks to amino acid sequences, the body knows what proteins to build and how to make them. Every protein has a standard amino acid sequence that must be followed. Those sequences are specified by the genes, which contain the DNA. Put simply, DNA is like the instruction manual in cells. It has the code for making the proteins our body needs to survive. Interestingly, every cell nucleus contains the DNA for making every human protein. In other words, the cells in our pancreas have the same codes as the cells in our skin. However, not all proteins are expressed in each cell. So different cells produce different proteins to give tissues and organs unique and vital functions. Unfortunately, deviation from the standard amino acid sequence can have consequences. One example is sickle cell disease, in which an error in just a single gene changes the shape and functionality of red blood cells. This image illustrates the building of a protein from amino acids. Peptide bonds link together single amino acids. As more amino acids are added, the amino acid's size, shape, and electrical charge can cause the strand to coil and fold over itself. Some proteins are functional as is once the amino acid sequence is completed. Others need to join with a separate molecule or molecules to gain function. The body knows how to make proteins thanks to the amino acid sequences found in the DNA. Messenger RNA copies a code in the nucleus in a process called transcription, and then that mRNA carries the code outside of the nucleus, where the protein is produced in a process called translation. As mentioned, proteins have standard amino acid sequences, and a deviation in just one amino acid can be consequential. That's the case for sickle cell disease, which changes the shape of red blood cells, impairing blood flow and oxygen delivery to tissues. Alright, that covers the first learning objective. Now that we've described the structure of proteins and amino acids, we'll explore the basics of protein metabolism, emphasizing digestion, absorption, storage, and turnover. Protein digestion aims to break protein down into amino acids, dipeptides, and tripeptides. Dipeptides and tripeptides consist of 2 and 3 amino acids respectively. Protein digestion begins in the stomach, where hydrochloric acid uncoils protein molecules and exposes the peptide bonds. That exposure allows an enzyme called pepsin to break peptide bonds and create polypeptides, which contain anywhere from 10 to 50 amino acids. Protein digestion finishes in the small intestine with the splitting of polypeptides into amino acids, dipeptides, and tripeptides. Enzymes from the pancreas and intestinal cells accomplish that process. Next, we have protein absorption. All protein absorption occurs in the small intestine. Intestinal cells accept amino acids, dipeptides, and tripeptides, but then most dipeptides and tripeptides are broken down before they're released. Notably, intestinal cells have separate sites for absorbing different amino acids, and some amino acids compete for the same absorption site. Thus, according to Sizer and Whitney, excessive intake of any one amino acid can limit the absorption of another. That would not be a concern with protein intake from food, though it highlights a potential risk if someone were to supplement with a single amino acid. Finally, like the carbohydrates, protein is a water-soluble nutrient. That means the intestinal cells release amino acids into the blood and they travel to the liver. In summary, protein digestion does not occur in the mouth. It begins in the stomach when the protein is exposed to the hydrochloric acid the stomach produces. The peptide bonds are exposed as the protein unwinds, and pepsin begins creating polypeptides. Most of the protein we eat arrives in the small intestine as polypeptides. Then enzymes from the pancreas and small intestine break them down into amino acids, dipeptides, and tripeptides, which can all enter the intestinal cells before reaching the blood. Here, we can see how amino acids, dipeptides, and tripeptides enter intestinal cells through receptors. Most of the dipeptides and tripeptides are then broken down into amino acids. As mentioned, more than one amino acid may use a single receptor. That creates a scenario in which excessive intake of one amino acid could lead to insufficient absorption of another. Coming to the end of this section, we can look at protein storage and turnover together. Sadly, the body has no capacity to store excess amino acids. All of the proteins in the body have a specific function, and there's no compound that's comparable to glycogen or adipose tissue, where excesses are stored with the purpose of being there when needed. Rather than storing excess amino acids are used as energy or turned into glucose or fatty acids. Furthermore, the body continuously breaks down old proteins and builds new ones. This process is called protein turnover. It emphasizes the need for adequate daily protein intake, so the body constantly has a supply of amino acids to work with. Here's an example of protein turnover in the skeletal muscle. Old muscle tissue breaks down, and the body relies on an adequate supply of amino acids to replace it with new muscle tissue. Similarly, the body continuously replaces old, worn-out skin cells to preserve our skin as the first line of defense against invaders. You can see how new skin cells are formed in the bottom layer, pushing the old skin cells to the surface to be shed. Protein is a foundational component of skin tissue, and sufficient quantities of amino acids must be available for this process to occur. Okay, that completes the second learning objective. Explore the basics of protein metabolism. Let's move on to the third learning objective, where we'll examine the roles of body proteins. Out of all the macronutrients, protein has the greatest number of functions. Body proteins provide structure and allow for movement. Skeletal muscle, bones, skin, tendons, and cartilage are protein-rich tissues. Proteins also serve as enzymes, hormones, and antibodies. So far, we have seen enzymes in the context of digestion, splitting compounds so they can be absorbed. However, there are thousands of enzymes that facilitate chemical reactions in the body. We've seen hormones act as chemical messengers to achieve and maintain homeostatic conditions, with insulin and glucagon being the examples covered. Antibodies haven't been discussed yet in this course, but they're part of the immune system and therefore protect the body from infection and disease. That's not all that proteins do. Proteins transport substances in the blood, like we saw in Chapter 5, where the protein and lipoproteins allow them to deliver lipids to cells. Proteins also help to maintain fluid and electrolyte balance because they keep the appropriate amount in the body's compartments. They help to maintain the acid-base balance of various body fluids because they resist changes in pH by acting as buffers. And they assist with blood clotting because they form a stringy net that traps blood cells. For fluid and electrolyte balance, one place we see proteins is in cell membranes, where they shuttle electrolytes in and out of the cell. This image provides a snapshot of the role of body proteins in structure and movement. On the left side, you can see the bones, the ligaments that connect them, and the cartilage that allows them to glide against each other without friction. On the right side, we have the skeletal muscle, which contracts to produce movement, and the tendons that attach the muscles to the bones. Other examples of protein-rich tissues include the skin and hair. Then we can also look at enzymes, which are proteins. We've seen enzymes work in the manner illustrated on top, where an enzyme splits a larger compound to create individual products. Nevertheless, enzymes in the body can work the other way around, taking two substrates and joining them to make a new product. Finally, we'll take a peek at proteins on cell membranes. Much of the exchange of fluids and electrolytes doesn't require transmembrane proteins, but some does, and those proteins are critical to maintaining the appropriate balance. That caps off the extensive list of roles of body proteins. One last function worth mentioning is using protein for energy. Proteins and amino acids can be broken down and used for energy, a process that requires the removal of the amine group. However, this is not a preferred fuel source for the body, which relies primarily on glucose and fatty acids. In addition to being used for energy, amino acids can be converted to glucose or fatty acids, which also requires the removal of the amine group. Using amino acids in this way increases in times of inadequacy and excess. For instance, if there's inadequate carbohydrate intake and the blood glucose level drops, the body can convert the available amino acids to glucose to bring it back up. Or, if the availability of amino acids far exceeds the body's ability to use them for protein building or energy, it can convert them to glucose or fatty acids and store them for later use. Putting it all together, we can view the fate of an amino acid as the following. When an amino acid arrives in a cell, it can be used to build a body protein, like skeletal muscle or antibodies. It can be converted to another amino acid or nitrogen-containing compound, like one of the non-essential amino acids. It can be used for energy, or it can be converted to glucose or a fatty acid, at which point it will carry out one of the functions of those compounds, or get stored as glycogen or adipose tissue. This image shows how the general structure of an amino acid is split. The amine group eventually finds its way to becoming urea, which is excreted in urine. The body can use the carbon skeleton in several ways, and the needs of the cell or body ultimately determine its fate. Alright, that covers the third learning objective. Now that we've examined the roles of body proteins, let's close out Chapter 6 by discussing nutrition recommendations for protein. Starting with daily protein intake, the RDA is 0.8 grams per kilogram per day for adults ages 19 and older, which is the amount needed to match losses in protein turnover. Meanwhile, the AMDR is 10 to 35% of total calories. To see these two recommendations at play, we can pretend we have Mr. Miller, who weighs 80 kilograms. We can take the RDA, multiply it by 80 kilograms, and get 64 grams per day. If we want to use the AMDR and know Mr. Miller needs 2,400 calories per day to maintain his body weight, we can take 10% of 2,400 and 35% of 2,400 and divide them each by 4 calories per gram, giving us a daily need of 60 to 210 grams. In my professional experience, I have found that the RDA method is the much more common way of determining protein needs. No matter how the needs are determined and the total amount, Mr. Miller would aim to satisfy the requirement by choosing different foods and beverages throughout the day. Starting from the left, we can see that oils, non-starchy vegetables, and fruits are poor sources. Then, as we begin to move right, we have grains, which are predominantly carbohydrates but contain some protein. We also have legumes in beans and lentils, which are examples of protein-rich plant-based foods, and nuts, which are another protein-rich plant-based food, though to a lesser degree. Dairy products make for an interesting case because there's a wide variety of protein as you go from milk to cheese to foods like yogurt and cottage cheese, with Greek yogurt topping the list at nearly 20 grams per cup. By the time we reach the right side, we have animal proteins like chicken, fish, and beef. Keep in mind that 3 ounces is roughly the size of a deck of cards. Finally, we'll shout out to tofu at 20 grams per cup. The soybean, from which foods like tofu and tempeh are created, is arguably the best plant-based source. Digging a little deeper into the comparison of animal and plant-based foods, we can see that 100 grams of broccoli contains roughly the same amount of protein as 100 grams of milk. On the surface, it seems they're comparable in protein content. Still, when you look at how much 100 grams is in common measurements, we find that you would have to eat approximately 1.5 cups of broccoli to get the 3 grams of protein. In contrast, you would only need to drink 3.5 ounces of milk, which is less than half a cup. A similar exercise exists with grilled chicken and peanut butter. 100 grams of chicken breast and peanut butter both provide approximately 25 grams of protein. Yet when we look at the energy load of 100 grams of each food, we see that we could get 25 grams of protein in 140 calories of chicken breast, whereas peanut butter would deliver 4 times that amount. The takeaway is that protein needs can be satisfied with a combination of plant-based and animal-based foods, but animal-based foods generally offer a more efficient way of getting there. In the end, the goal is to create a net protein balance where protein intake matches protein losses, such that the protein from food sufficiently replaces worn-out cells. If protein losses outpace protein intake, the body is in an undesirable state of negative protein balance, which can cause tissues to deteriorate. If protein intake outpaces losses, the body is in a positive protein balance, creating a favorable environment for growth and development. With that being said, we must consider several factors affecting protein needs. First, there are various circumstances that increase the demand for protein. That includes growth and development, aging, pregnancy, physical activity, and numerous diseases and medical procedures. There are far fewer circumstances that decrease the demand for protein, but one is compromised kidney function, as the kidneys are responsible for handling the byproducts of protein metabolism in the body. Finishing with protein deficiency and excess, having inadequate intake slows protein synthesis and increases protein breakdown. Early effects include skeletal muscle loss and weakened immune defenses. Long-term inadequate intake can be fatal, with the deterioration of vital organs and blood vessels. Regarding populations to watch out for, children and older adults are at the highest risk of deficiency. A vegetarian or vegan diet that lacks variety may also be a concern, particularly if the diet is limited in legumes, nuts and seeds, and soy or soy-based foods. On the opposite end, overconsumption of protein offers no health benefits and may pose a health risk for people with compromised kidney function. Exactly how much is too much is quite unclear though, and no tolerable upper intake level has been established for healthy individuals. Overall, the average protein intake in the United States is approximately 80 grams per day, or around 15% of total calories, which falls right in the AMDR. As a result, protein is not considered a nutrient of concern. That completes the fourth and final learning objective. We discussed nutrition recommendations for protein. If you want to check out parts of the chapter that weren't covered, here are the sections I recommend.